Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. It's becoming increasingly clear that if there is a metaphorical corporation or a corporation that speaks metaphorically for our age, it's OpenAI. We've done many shows on it, and its interesting leader, Sam Altman. They claim on their website, at least OpenAI, to be in the business of ensuring that artificial general intelligence, which is otherwise known as AGI, benefits all of humanity. Everybody knows, of course, that's a lie. They're benefiting themselves. They're a for-profit company, although sometimes they're a non-profit company. It depends perhaps how they wake up in the morning. The same is true of their mercurial, to use a polite word, CEO, Sam Altman, very controversial fellow. Here we have an image of him with Johnny Ive, the guy who invented the iPhone, who is on board now in OpenAI. We've done lots of shows on OpenAI. We did one, or a couple actually, with my friend Parmi Olson, Supremacy. She has it was a book that won the FT Business Book of the Year last year. And recently we've done a couple of shows with Keach Hagee, who is the author. She works for the Wall Street Journal, and she's the author of a new book on Altman, The Optimist, Sam Altman, OpenAI, and the race to invent the future. Another way to describe an optimist is a salesman, which is, I think, what Keach Hagee thinks Altman is. And today we're talking with another authority on OpenAI, perhaps the authority. Karen Howe has been reporting on OpenAI for many years. She did it from Boston. She's doing it from Hong Kong, where she lives. And she's the author of a best-selling new book, an immediate bestseller on the New York Times best-selling list, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI. And I'm thrilled and honored that Karen Howe is joining us from Boston, where she's on book tour. Karen, congratulations on the new book. You've been following this company and our friend Sam Altman for many years now. Am I right to suggest that it's somehow this company and Altman himself are metaphors for our odd age?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Andrew. I do think that it's important to understand both Sam Altman, the figure, as well as the organization that he built sort of in his image, in order to fully realize where we are currently with the dominant AI development paradigm, which I call the scaling at all costs AI development paradigm, and where that could ultimately lead us. Altman is very much a product of Silicon Valley, and so it's not really a coincidence that AI development today takes the same approach that Silicon Valley has taken for the last decade plus, with this aggressive race dynamics, this aggressive desire to grow and consume a lot of resources, and a inherent drive to try and use this technology to dominate the world.
So just going back to that front page, when you go to the OpenAI website, you learn about the company. When they say our mission is to ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity, do they know they're lying? Or is this just so much in the water now in Silicon Valley, especially in marketing terms, that this somehow comes naturally to them?
So I opened my book with a quote from Sam Altman, where early on in his career, when he was coming up in Silicon Valley, he spent a lot of time blogging. And there's this 2013 blog post where he quotes another person and the quote goes like this: successful people build companies, more successful people build countries, the most successful people build religions. And then he reflects on it in the rest of the blog post saying, it seems to me that founders usually set off to build a religion and then they realize the easiest way to do so is to build a company. And so I think the way to think about that mission statement of OpenAI benefiting all of humanity, I like to call it a civilizing mission because the title of my book ultimately nods to an argument I make that we really need to think of OpenAI like a new form of empire. And all empires have civilizing missions. And Altman identified early in his career that in order to really rally extraordinary resources and top talent around a particular quest, you have to give them this sense of a higher purpose, a belief system. So I do think that a lot of people at OpenAI genuinely believe in this mission. They are oriented towards that mission, and they think that their actions are fully aligned with their interpretation of that mission. But of course, the challenge with something like the phrase benefits all of humanity is it's completely in the eye of the beholder. And so throughout OpenAI's history, there's been a lot of drama because different people interpret it in totally polar opposite ways.
So if you're right, and there is an imperial quality to Altman OpenAI, could one argue that's not necessarily a bad thing? After all, some empires, one can think of Rome, for example, have indeed civilized the world. Is there an argument to be made if these people were actually being honest? Could they come out? I mean, Peter Thiel might do this. He might have the intellectual nerve. He might actually take pleasure in doing this to suggest, look, we're just the next version of empire. The Romans did it. The British did it. The Americans in an odd way did it. And now we're doing it.
I think you're exactly right that there are quite a lot of Silicon Valley figures that would have no problem saying that they are a new form of empire. And in fact, Thiel has explicitly said, as you pointed out, that democracy doesn't work. And increasingly, we're seeing growing popularity within the tech industry around this idea of the politics of exit. We need to move beyond democracy. We need to start rethinking how to organize society to not just be organized in nation states where we have democratically elected officials, but actually be organized as companies with CEOs at the top. And essentially, people have pointed out that that's basically just advocating for some system of authoritarianism where you just have people at the top dictating what people at the bottom need to do. I personally, like my politics, I would very much push back against the idea that empire is somewhat that is broadly beneficial to people. Certainly, it is very enriching to a small few at the top. But what we've seen, and the reason why I articulate this argument that we need to recognize these companies as empire, is that there is a huge amount of harm and dispossession that is happening for a majority of people around the world right now to develop what OpenAI claims is this so-called pursuit of artificial general intelligence, this idea that they're going to eventually fundamentally recreate all of human intelligence in computers. And I document in the book that there are all of these social, labor, and environmental harms that they are trying to paper over with this idea that they are civilizing everyone. Um, Many empires in the past, I mean, you could argue that there were certain people that did benefit from an imperial model, but there were also a vast vast populations that did not at all and still to this day live under that legacy.
Yeah, and there's certainly, in terms, it seems, in terms of your argument in Empire of AI, the imperial, it's more than just a metaphor, empire. You mean it literally. And
Yeah.
perhaps the example that's is most relevant, maybe not so much Rome, is 19th century European colonialism. You spend time in the book in Kenya, Colombia, Chile. Not all these countries were, of course, formally colonized, certainly in the 19th century. But is this European colonialism in an odd way 2.0, especially given the environmental, as you said earlier, the environmental consequences of AI and the way in which it's actually wrecking an environment which is already in a pretty poor state?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that OpenAI decided early on within the company was to aggressively scale existing techniques around AI development as a way to race towards being number one in AI progress. And at the time, that was a really actually not very respected idea in among the research community. The idea that you would just scale existing techniques, people thought certainly there could be the invention of new techniques that would allow you to actually get to more progress with more efficiency. But OpenAI wasn't, they didn't care about efficiency, they cared about speed. And so what they ended up doing was taking AI models that already existed and pumping historic amounts of data into those AI models, and therefore needing unprecedented large supercomputers to be built to do the computational crunching on those historic amounts of data. And so what we're seeing now is a rapid proliferation of data centers and supercomputers all around the world. And McKinsey recently came out with a report that said at the pace that this AI computational infrastructure expansion is happening, the global grid would need to add 2 to 6 times the amount of energy consumed by California annually to keep up with that pace. And most of that will be serviced by fossil fuels. So there's already been reporting showing that coal plants that were meant to be retired are no longer being retired in order to service these data centers. There are new methane gas turbines that are being plopped into mostly working class communities and pumping a lot of air pollutants into those communities in order to continue running these data centers and supercomputers 24/7. So it is absolutely accelerating the climate crisis. It's also turning into a public health crisis by generating more air pollution. And it's turning into a fresh water crisis where these data centers need to be cooled with fresh water because any other type of water corrodes the equipment. It leads to bacterial growth. And so most of these data centers actually get plugged into the public drinking water supply of towns and communities. And Bloomberg recently had an article looking at how 2/3 of the current AI data center expansion is actually going in water scarce areas. So we also have the exacerbation of the global freshwater crisis with this rapid escalation of infrastructure.
Do we need to credit Altman at all? I mean, he's obviously a brilliant guy, and he's clearly a gambler. I mean, Keith Hagee says he's the optimist, the ultimate salesman. He's a gambler too. Should we credit him at least with being willing to make the bet on generative AI? I mean, before ChatGPT, what 3, no one even believed in this technology. I mean, Google were the one who published the first white paper on it, and Sam Altman took it up and ran with it. So should we at least credit him with that, with having the instinct of the entrepreneur to make this huge gamble?
He's absolutely a visionary. He is absolutely someone that is very effective at motivating people and mobilizing capital and resources towards expansive projects. My criticism of him is not that. My criticism of him is that he also has a very narrow, I would argue, worldview that has led him to take a gamble where he richly benefits from the gamble, but many, many other people are harmed. And what I fundamentally believe is that AI development absolutely does not actually need to have these costly built-in externalities. In fact, before OpenAI actually moved towards large-scale AI models, there was a significant amount of research that was happening that was actually going the opposite direction towards really, really tiny AI models. And there was actually a growing realization among AI researchers that you could get away with extremely small data sets and extremely small amounts of computational power to build quite powerful AI models. And the key was you just had to clean and curate those data sets to make sure that every single piece of information you're feeding into the AI model is high quality. And OpenAI made an explicit choice that they did not care about the quality of their data sets. They just cared about quantity. So they started using internet scale data sets that were heavily polluted. And when you do that, when you move from clean data sets to polluted data sets, that's when you start having highly inefficient AI development. That's when you start needing extraordinary amounts of computational resources. And so the thing that I criticize is the fact that they chose a path that for speed, but it was also reckless. And the reason they have the privilege to do that is because they don't bear the brunt of that recklessness. The gamble that Altman took, either he doesn't get much from it or he gets huge positive upside. But he is an optimist in part because it's really easy to be optimistic when pretty much every version of the future you're going to be fine.
Yeah, and you're of course gambling with other people's money, and not that he
Exactly.
cares. I mean, he has so much money. I don't think he's even paid at OpenAI. The model you talk about flooding the market is certainly the one that OpenAI are using. There's a piece in today's New York Times about OpenAI's, and I use this word carefully, but I think it's the right word, attempt to colonize the university, of literally
Mm.
taking over the university. And given the state politically, culturally, technologically of the university, it's very vulnerable. But would it be fair to say, Karen, that this neo-colonial strategy is certainly not invented by OpenAI? I mean, Facebook did it, Microsoft did it, Apple's done it, Google's done it. I mean, this is simply the Silicon Valley way, that empire comes, or empire building comes naturally. You use this word scale. It's really the only way to build, for better or worse, trillion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar companies.
Yeah, I think that's a really important way to understand OpenAI and its ideology is an extension of Silicon Valley. It is not a fundamentally new ideology that they are pushing. I do think that they are the most extreme version of the Silicon Valley ideology, and that the amount of resources and capital that they now consume in order to develop these technologies is orders of magnitude more than before. So, one data point that we can look at is just Meta, because Meta was part of the social media era and it's now pushing itself into the generative AI era. And during the social media era, Meta accumulated data from 4 million user accounts. And that is extraordinary, 4 billion user accounts. And that's an extraordinary volume of data by any measure. But in the generative AI era, Meta still felt that that would not be enough to develop performant generative AI models. So the New York Times also reported on discussions internally at Meta to not only unwind the data privacy rules that they had implemented post Cambridge Analytica to self-regulate, but also to potentially buy Simon and Schuster to get access to all of those books as part of augmenting the data set that they already had. And ultimately they didn't end up buying it. They ended up just pirating those books. Now there's been significant reporting showing that Llama, Meta's generative AI model, is trained on pirated books from the dark web. So that is why there is both a continuation and a step change or escalation in OpenAI as compared to, the previous generation of Silicon Valley companies.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering, of course, that YouTube, for example, which now is the really monopolist when it comes to online video, probably in some ways worth more than the Google search engine, was founded on piracy. So piracy itself comes naturally to Silicon Valley. Karen, you've written extensively about what you call the events of November 2023, when there was this civil war within, civil coup almost within OpenAI. There was an attempt to get rid of Altman. He survived, prospered. It was a Shakespearean drama. He stabbed everyone else in the back or in the front. What does these events of November 2023 and this odd psychotic state of OpenAI, of trying simultaneously to be a for-profit and a non-profit company, how does that enrich the metaphor of the company for our age? It seems as if Silicon Valley itself is a kind of an extension of that, of simultaneously for and non-profit. Whichever hat you're more comfortable using, you put on for that moment.
That's a really great point. I hadn't really thought about that, but you're absolutely right in that at its core, OpenAI and Silicon Valley are extremely capitalistic organizations that are primarily motivated by profit. But many Silicon Valley companies then wrap themselves around this nonprofit exterior, this idea that they are ultimately doing things for social benefit. And it just so happens that OpenAI literally lays its cards out in that way by having a nonprofit wrapped around a for-profit. But this is one of the things that was fascinating to me about OpenAI when I was reporting it is, I've also reported on Facebook and Google in the past, and OpenAI is uniquely confused as an organization because employees fundamentally disagree about whether they're working at a for-profit and a nonprofit as well. So there's been heavy disagreements through OpenAI's history about what in fact OpenAI is, and is it ultimately, the nonprofit mission is our fiduciary responsibility is to humanity. Sorry, there's a train passing by.
That's Sam Altman spying on you.
Our fiduciary responsibility is to humanity, which doesn't have any legal meaning. Usually a for-profit would say our fiduciary responsibility is to shareholders, and there's actually legal teeth around that. But some employees would say, yes, that's why we're not a for-profit. We are, at the end of the day, truly a nonprofit, and we act in the benefit of all of humanity. And then other people would say, no, but we're also just trying to commercialize products here. And that is unique in that in other organizations like Facebook, like Google, like Apple, people are on the same page about the fact that they are ultimately working for a business. And so even though other Silicon Valley organizations do have a ideological cloak that they wrap their for-profit business around, the employees understand that it is still a business and ultimately they need to be doing things for the bottom line. But at OpenAI, that was actually very contentious. Not everyone agreed that that was what their primary purpose was.
And the other sort of analogy you can make is with Sam Bankman-Fried's FDX. That was, of course, a criminal confusion of nonprofit and for-profit.
Yeah.
You've looked as carefully into OpenAI as anyone. They're not FTX, and Altman isn't Sam Bankman-Fried. But is it conceivable in the future that OpenAI might turn into the Enron of our age, of blowing itself up and blowing up perhaps the rest of the economy?
I do very much worry about the amount of capital that they're accumulating from investors with promises to give back that investment somehow when they
Mm.
do not actually have a robust business right now. And those investments are coming from, university endowments. They're coming from, they're taking out debt to invest in these. I'm personally not a financial expert, so I can't fully say what level of risk they've essentially given to that they've sort of distributed through the accumulation of this extremely high amount of capital. They recently raised 40 billion, which is the largest private investment in Silicon Valley history. But many investors have flagged to me that they are deeply concerned about this. The moment the bubble pops, it is not just going to be felt by OpenAI, it's going to be felt throughout the economy. And right now, OpenAI has not demonstrated, none of these AI companies, Anthropic included, have not demonstrated how on earth they're going to make back that 40 billion. They haven't actually figured out how to monetize at that level. They've tried subscriptions. The subscriptions aren't actually like Altman has said, they aren't actually covering the operational expenses of running that service. And they have even considered pricing the subscriptions at thousands of dollars a month to try and recoup some of the costs. They're now considering monetizing the free tier of ChatGPT through advertising. So they're kind of shifting back to the social media search engine era of business model.
And
But
with the surveillance, the damage of surveillance of I know Shoshana Zuboff blurbed
yes,
your book. Of course, she was the woman who wrote best about our age of
surveillance
surveillance
capitalism.
capitalism. So they're falling
Yes.
into that trap. So what we're talking about potentially, Karen, is just another South Sea bubble, a tulip dot-com crash. It makes sense with all the promises. I mean, the one thing that Altman seems so skilled at is getting people to believe in what he's saying and to get
Mhm.
them to invest in him personally and, of course, in his company economically. But ultimately, this thing you're suggesting might just blow up, not just OpenAI, but Anthropic and all these other AI startups.
Yeah, both in terms of the financials and also because the technology falls apart often in various different use cases. Even as these models have appeared to advance in certain ways, they still can't do certain fundamental math problems. And they still are not reliably generating code. People in Silicon Valley like to pretend that these systems are already fully functional as software engineers, but I speak to software engineers outside of Silicon Valley using these tools, and they say, no, we cannot actually trust that this code is going to be high quality enough to deploy in, critical infrastructure systems, for example. And so I think there's going to be continue being more and more, and there already has been more and more skepticism around what is actually the value proposition of this technology. Is it actually up to the task for a broad based economic diffusion? And inevitably, the rubber's going to meet the road, and people who had speculatively thought that this technology would have far more value and therefore deserve far more investment will start to realize maybe it did not.
One thing, though, that perhaps has changed, and I talked about this with Keach Hagee last month, was our new world of sort of Trumpian nationalist authoritarianism.
Mhm.
This weekend, Elon Musk and Donald Trump have fallen out. One of the beneficiaries, perhaps the key beneficiary of this falling out, is Sam Altman, of course, who's Musk's
Mhm.
enemy. But I wonder, given the way in which AI is increasingly being perceived within Trump world as being America's thing and America's weapon against China, that when this thing, as you suggest, begins to fall apart, which it perhaps will, some people believe you're suggesting maybe inevitably will, we won't be back in 1999, 2000, where the dot-com crash happened and everyone lost their money and then we just moved on. The US government, in an odd way, both economically and politically, will be forced to step in. And it's
Yeah.
an interesting scenario. And that's the difference, perhaps, between 2025 or the mid 20s, late 20s, and the last part of the 20th century. Government Mao is much more involved and responsible. And we have the rebirth of nationalism, perhaps
Mhm.
appropriately, given the title of your book, Empire of AI, two empires, China and America, going at it in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think the best analogy that I've found to describe what's happening now with the Trump administration is the British East India Company and the nationalization of it with the British Crown. So the British East India Company, for listeners that are less familiar, it was originally a company, right, that was based in London, and it was given a charter to strike mutually beneficial economic agreements, trade agreements with the Mughal Empire in India. And initially, that's what it did. It did mostly commercial activity, but then it gained significant economic leverage within India. Then it gained significant political leverage within India. And then eventually it became the apex predator within that ecosystem and started acting as an imperial power, a corporate empire that waged war, collected taxes, and subjugated the Indian subcontinent. It also eventually reached a point where it both felt inevitable and extremely strong, and it was weak at its foundation, so it actually collapsed. And when it collapsed, the British Crown nationalized the company, and then that's when India formally became a colony of the British Empire. And I very much see both this corporate empire, state empire dynamic playing out with OpenAI and the Trump administration. Trump is absolutely also trying to fortify the American empire, which is from the government, a state based empire. Altman is trying to fortify OpenAI's corporate empire. And because it's similarly rapidly growing, but in some ways feels inevitable, but is weak at its foundations. Inevitably, it could collapse, and then it'll be up to the Trump administration, or if it happens in the next administration, it'll be up to the US government what it wants to do at that point. Do they feel like that these companies are too big to fail or too important for the US versus China race that they step in and somehow do the modern day version of nationalizing these companies to continue expanding and fortifying its empire against what they perceive as the Chinese empire. So yeah, it almost is quite literally playing out, and history is replaying itself in real time.
First as tragedy, then as farce, as one 19th century writer described it. It's interesting you bring up the East India
Yes.
Company. I've done a couple of shows with my friend William Dalrymple, who's based in India. His book, The Anarchy, is the best book on the East
It
India
is
Company.
absolutely.
And I've always found it particularly interesting that John Stuart Mill worked for the East India Company. It was his kind of day job. I'm not suggesting that there was an inevitable intimacy between liberal values and European colonialism, but perhaps Mill is the Altman, or Altman is the John Stuart Mill of the 21st century. Although I'm not sure he's as much of a feminist as Mill. In all seriousness, Karen, this is all very troubling, isn't it? I mean, we can laugh and all the rest of it, but you're suggesting that we're on very thin ice here, that this is an imperial conquest, that whichever way the OpenAI coin drops, and maybe it's a crypto coin, we lose. Either it wins and we loses, or it loses and we loses. Is there any positive outcome to this situation?
Absolutely, in the sense that I do not think that all of these possible futures that I'm currently portraying are versions of the future that would happen if no one does anything and allows the corporate empire to keep being an empire and expanding itself. But there is, of course, plenty of opportunity for people to do something about it, to take action and prevent this from happening. I'm very much a believer that really nothing is inevitable. There's certainly things that are highly predictable if you allow the trajectory to continue, but we can always shape the future. We have the agency to do that. And when I think about the full supply chain of AI development, which I focus on and try to make visible within my book, there are so many different types of ingredients that go into the production of these AI technologies that these companies need access to. And there are so many different spaces that they also need access to deploy that technology. So I'm talking about the data, the land for their data centers, the energy and water that's needed to power and cool their data centers, the schools that they need access to deploy their AI technologies, hospitals, government agencies, and many other spaces. And Silicon Valley has done a really good job in the last decade plus of making people feel like all of these resources and all of these spaces that are actually collectively owned, publicly owned, are owned by Silicon Valley, but they're not. This data is our data. It's our personal private data that we put online without the understanding that it could be trained for these models. It's the intellectual property of artists, writers, and creators. And the land is the land of communities. Water is a public resource for these communities. The access to electricity, that's a human right that should be collectively owned and is typically publicly governed. The schools, the hospitals, all of these spaces are also collectively governed by the constituencies of these different spaces. And so we've already seen many different groups all along the supply chain of AI development and deployment actually reasserting and reclaiming their ownership over those resources and those spaces. We've seen artists and writers sue these companies and say, no, you cannot take our intellectual property. We've seen hundreds of communities around the world actually push back against data centers just plopping into their communities, ratcheting up their utility bills, and taking away their fresh water resources. I write about a Chilean community that did this so effectively that they've actually stalled a Google data center from being built within their community for 5 years at this point. And we've also seen students and teachers actively now discussing, wait, what do we actually want AI in our classrooms? And if so, under what terms, to make sure that ultimately this helps foster our critical thinking instead of eroding our critical thinking? And if we continue to do that 100,000 times over, then it will really force these companies to change course. It'll make the trajectory of AI development shift from an imperial approach to a much more democratic one that is broadly beneficial. And there are historical analogies of consumers, residents, citizens effectively doing this before for different industries. The fashion industry also had an extraordinary amount of environmental and labor harms, but because the awareness around these issues grew over time and people started taking collective action to shift their behaviors. Eventually, entirely new markets were created for ethically sourced and sustainable fashion, and there were new international groups that started being created to watch these organizations and their labor rights, their human rights track records. There were new labels that were created to brand certain things as certified or not certified. And so we just need more of that collective action within the AI space. And the first step is to recognizing that that is actually even possible.
Yeah, I wrote a book about this a few years ago, How to Fix the Future. A couple of days ago, I did a show with my old friend, Silicon Valley-based entrepreneur, futurist Keith Teare. He believes everything is possible, nothing is inevitable. One of the models he uses, and I'm curious as to your take on this, is Sam Altman's WorldCoin, a cryptocurrency initiative, which at least in Keith's mind is an attempt to pay people back to redistribute the wealth of the AI community and of Silicon Valley broadly. Should we trust these kind of utopian schemes like WorldCoin, or is it just one more piece of the Altman arsenal that's going to actually create more empire?
Yeah, it's just another empire building tool. I mean, this literally harkens back to the British East India Companies now starting to collect and distribute taxes or collect and just yeah, it's you're essentially the idea of a universal basic income, which Altman has long been a proponent of, is just a government safety net, but distributed by corporates. And those corporates are not publicly elected. So you're just taking something that should be distributed through publicly elected officials and privatizing it. You're taking a publicly governed resource and turning it into something private. And that is essentially what the British East India Company did. It continued to get more and more control over what was originally meant to be done by state or by government and did it by corporation. And when these corporations or when a particular figure like Altman becomes the apex predator, they can act in their self-interest. There's no checks and balances on their power.
Right, and there's something particularly creepy about taking eye scanning everyone around the world,
Right,
getting their data of their eyes, but literally owning them in a data sense, and then somehow
right.
paying them in crypto coins, which themselves are some sort of product of Altman's empire.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Making currencies and deciding when and who to give it based on harvesting your biometric data.
Karen, you're based. You're talking to me from Boston, but you're normally based in Hong Kong. From that perch, from an interesting vantage point, what are the Chinese? And I know it's a general term; it's probably in itself a kind of an imperial term. But what's the take on OpenAI in China? And could we accept the argument by some people in Silicon Valley that even if they might acknowledge some of your arguments are correct, that OpenAI is infinitely better than anything that will come out of China, and there has to be a winner here?
No, because this is what this argument has gotten us. These companies in the US have continuously made this argument to the US government and led the US government down a particular regulatory path where they have been using export controls to try and restrict the Chinese companies' access to the most advanced AI chips, computer chips to date. Silicon Valley companies persuaded the Biden administration that this would inevitably lead China to fall behind the US. And that was, in addition to not regulating US companies, this was the best way to widen the gap in capabilities between American companies and Chinese companies. What has that strategy actually gotten us? Chinese companies have now innovated to circumvent the restrictions that the US government has taken through export controls. And we ended up with DeepSeek, which is a Chinese AI model developed by a Chinese firm called Highflyer, where under the restrictions of fewer computational resources, they were still able to develop a model that is basically the same level of capability as what OpenAI developed using 2 orders of magnitude more resources, 2 orders of magnitude more cost. So not only did that strategy not work, and now Chinese companies are even less dependent on American technologies now, it also revealed that this entire argument is totally bogus. This argument that if you don't regulate American companies, but you try to restrict Chinese companies, it will be better off for everyone, has literally panned out in the opposite direction, where the American companies have completely turned their back on the idea of democratic AI development. So Americans have had their rights eroded. Consumers of or people that are subjugated to these AI technologies have also had their rights eroded. There is no model right now of democratic, so-called democratic AI, and it's also been at extraordinary and unnecessary costs to labor, society, and the environment. And now it really appears like Silicon Valley has made a laughingstock of itself because DeepSeek demonstrated that they could literally pull off the same thing with a minuscule fraction of the resources and the harms. And now there are more countries in the global south, more researchers in the global south and in resource scarce areas that are much more keen to partner with Chinese companies and their particular approach because they see it as much more accessible and reasonable than the American one.
Finally, Karen, it's all so interesting. We'll have to get you back on the show. Your new book, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares, and Sam Altman's OpenAI is already a New York Times bestseller. The biggest bestseller, though, of this season is Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's Abundance, a book about reinventing America and certainly reinventing American government in an age of potential abundance. It's triggered a huge debate on the left. Even the Wall Street Journal's writing pieces about this. I take your point about resisting some of this technology.
Yeah.
But is there also a case that Thompson and Klein certainly play around and have triggered a debate about progressives, Democrats? You're clearly on the left. You're no fan of Trump or Musk or Thiel. Is there a case to be made that the age of AI, maybe we will or won't get to AGI, maybe there are some problems with some of the aspects of generative AI, but it's clearly changing stuff. It's scaling brain work. Is there a case to be made that progressives need to embrace the idea of abundance and shape it accordingly, not just resisting companies like OpenAI and Silicon Valley, but actually using it in the interests of everyone?
I believe in the ability of AI, broadly defined, to ultimately lead to more abundance, but I do not believe that Silicon Valley's particular conception of AI development is going to do that in any sense of the word. And I do think that there needs to be regulation put
Well, I
on these
take your
companies in
point
order.
on that, but what about rather than more government? Klein and Thompson are arguing for a different kind of government, a more efficient, effective government. Is there a case to be made, in your view, for that?
I don't think so. And the reason is because the light touch I mean, we have a very unwieldy government, but they've taken a light touch approach to the AI industry thus far, and it hasn't actually led us to a place that will lead to more abundance. Because the the version of AI that leads to abundance for me is task-specific AI models that can be trained on small amounts of data, small amounts of computational resources, and involve the participation of communities. And there are multiple reasons that this is beneficial. First of all, it descales things, so we're no longer talking about a approach that inherently has significant environmental and labor harms. It also leads to actually much more diffusion of AI across many facets of society. Most industries and most communities are actually data poor. So if you automatically index on a version of AI development that requires a huge data imperative to meet, you will automatically not be able to develop AI models for most communities and most industries. So the ultimately what I think is going to lead us to more AI enabled abundance is actually a completely different we need to like turn the ship 180 degrees. And that's just not going to happen without some kind of top down and bottoms up governance, and not just a light touch approach, but really setting down very, very clear and strict guardrails to force companies to do that. Because at the end of the day, they've already demonstrated what their end game is under a light touch approach, and it is in the exact opposite direction of what would lead us to abundance.
Now for something completely different. We will see. Karen Howe is the author of the best-selling Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares, and Sam Altman's OpenAI. Thank you so much, Karen. You really bring an important wisdom and polemicism to the debate. We'll get you back on the show because there's so much more to talk about. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Andrew.